GAO's latest high-risk report flags uneven preparedness across states and localities, despite billions in FEMA grants and expanded training programs. We'll explore what drives these disparities, how performance is measured, and the implications of a bigger local role in future disasters, with Christopher Currie, Director, Homeland Security and Justice at the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Currie, it's nice to see you again.
You too. Thank you.
A couple of months ago, we covered your first report in this Disaster Assistance High Risk series where you looked at the federal response workforce. You're back with report number 2, looking at state and local response capabilities. Talk to us about the headlines.
Well, the headline for this report is that the capabilities of state and local governments across the country vary drastically for a disaster or other type of event. You know, what we did is we actually look at data that the states prepare and provide to FEMA as part of their justification for federal preparedness grants. It's meant to be a very, very honest self-assessment of capabilities. And for that reason, we actually don't provide states individually. We sort of roll it up and wrap it up anonymously because some of that information, as you imagine, could be sensitive. But, you know, we looked at states that have been involved in major disasters over the last 2 to 3 years, and some of these states are very experienced, large states, and even they vary in terms of their capabilities. There's actually 32 capabilities that FEMA sets in the National Preparedness System that you want to achieve to be prepared to respond for a disaster or a large event. And states vary. Some of the areas they were less than 10% prepared. Met less than 10% of those capabilities, and others, they were much more. So the reason that's important right now is to understand that if you were to change the support that FEMA and the federal government provide to states quickly, then they're going to have capability gaps that are going to have to get filled.
Let's talk about some of the support that FEMA does provide. One of the ways that they support the states is through preparedness grants, and those help build local capacity. What did you find as you dug into the preparedness grants?
Those preparedness grants started after 9/11, and since 9/11, there's been like over $60 billion provided to states. It's the main way that the federal government transfers funds to state and local governments to get them ready to handle something bad that could happen, not just a natural disaster, but it could be a terrorist attack. And those grants have built capabilities tremendously over the years. But those capabilities change over time, and we identify through real-world events and exercises the gaps that still need to be addressed. So I'll give you a great example. After Hurricane Helene and after other disasters, housing for disaster survivors is always a perennial challenge. Housing is an area, it's a capability area that is assessed, and we want to build up through these preparedness grants. It's an area that states, even very experienced disaster states, still fall short of in terms of their capabilities. And the federal government kind of comes in after a disaster and provides a lot of that support because states don't. So if the federal government's not going to provide it, then someone else is going to have to provide it, and that's going to be someone at the state or local level.
Talk to me about the flexibility and the allocation framework for these grants. Is it meeting requirements? Does it seem to be focused on the places that have the greatest need?
Yeah, the grants are actually given out. There's a couple different ways they're given out. There's a portion of the grants that are supposed to go towards certain national priorities, and FEMA sets those targets. So think about things like election security or other national priorities. But then a large part of the grants they're discretionary, and the states can use them, and they're supposed to use them in the areas where they assess they have gaps. And that's the data I was talking about earlier that we provided. So, for example, certain states may have gaps in their ability to handle a mass casualty situation, or may struggle to house disaster survivors because they don't have a lot of housing stock or rental. So those are things they're supposed to identify and then target those grants towards those specific areas, which makes sense. You want to close your gaps so you're ready to go when something happens.
FEMA also provides a great deal of training and technical assistance. How effective has that been in helping states be ready?
Since this is, I think, one of the biggest success stories since Hurricane Katrina. You know, if you remember Hurricane Katrina, the issue was the role of various levels of government was not clear, and thus nobody stepped up and was proactive in responding to that event. People lost their lives. Since that time, the National Preparedness System and FEMA leading that has been extremely effective through exercises, through training, through just regional relationships in taking care of a lot of those problems. So today we are way more proactive and responsive to disasters than we were 20 years ago in Hurricane Katrina. And so that's a huge success story. Having said that, a disaster is a disaster. There's always going to be things that happen that you don't expect. And there's areas where states still have major gaps and that require resources and people to address those. And the federal government comes in and fills a lot of those gaps. Here's a great example. Hurricane Helene happened and devastated a very remote part of our country in places like, rural Tennessee and North Carolina and Virginia. States and localities don't have the search and rescue assets, for such a large swath of that kind of terrain. Federal government provided a lot of that. They provided a lot of the air support, the land support, the temporary bridges, Army Corps of Engineers. So, the federal government really kicks in when something's too big for a state or locality to handle.
I'm speaking with Chris Currie. He's Director, Homeland Security and Justice at GAO. So, Chris, all of this begs the question. This administration has been very clear that it wants states and localities to pick up more of the disaster response mission and that it wants a much smaller FEMA. Given what you found in your first study about the federal response workforce and the impacts of downsizing there, and now the variability in state and local readiness, what are the implications for national disaster response?
I want to make one thing really clear, because all I know is what we know now and what the data that we've looked at. And I want to be clear that nothing has changed in terms of FEMA's responsibilities today. There's been a lot of talk about it. There's been the President's Council that studied it, but there has been no change so far. So FEMA is still responsible for what it was responsible for 2 years ago. They have lost some staff. We looked at that in our first report, as you mentioned. They have lost about 1,000 staff and maybe a little bit more than that at this point. But they haven't been cut drastically or cut in half as has been discussed. So they still have the same responsibilities, and they're still performing the same functions on disasters throughout the country, even though last year we didn't have a huge landfalling hurricane. So what's important about that is that, everybody's waiting to hear what the next steps are going to be and, what's going to happen to FEMA. One of the things we wanted to do in this report is we wanted to provide a comprehensive picture of preparedness to show what's going to be necessary if that FEMA support is pulled back or FEMA is made smaller. And the bottom line is that states and localities are going to have to do more. However, it's going to be critical that they have the time to prepare for that. For example, a lot of the assistance that's provided to individual survivors, like cash payments and housing, that comes from the federal government. It does not come from the state or local government. So if FEMA is not going to be providing that, the state or the locality is going to have to fill that need. And that requires a lot of money and a lot of preparation and planning that you can't just turn on in a heartbeat. You don't want to start figuring out programs to help people after a disaster happens.
You bring up a good point on that time to prepare. As you did this survey, you talked to lots of state and local response officials. What did they tell you beyond time to prepare that they were going to need to be effective?
Very simple. Just tell us what we need to do. Tell us what we're going to expect from you, the federal government. Nobody knows right now. The FEMA Council has not finished its work. There has been reform legislation introduced in the House and in the Senate, but nothing has passed yet. So the key message is tell us what the roles and responsibilities are going to be so we know what to prepare for so we don't get caught flat-footed in the case of something really bad happening. And, Terry, one of my fears is that last year, like I said, we didn't have a large landfalling hurricane. It was the first year in a long time we did not. We did not have a large catastrophic disaster other than Los Angeles fires early in the year. So my fear is that folks are going to look at last year and say, hey, things have gone pretty well. We don't need to be thinking about it. And that is an absolute mistake because, we've seen in years like 2017, 2018, 2024, my fear is we're going to have, another situation this year or next with, multiple concurrent disasters, and we're just not going to have the resources to deal with them.
So what will you be watching for in the next few months to see if Congress and the federal government and the states have taken your recommendations on board?
Well, I would like to, when the FEMA Council report comes out, I would like to see in whatever the execution is for FEMA reform or the changes in how the system works now, I would like to see an understanding of how this needs to be rolled out so states and localities can prepare and have as clear roles and responsibilities as possible. We'd also like to see them address many of the problems that we've pointed out. And to be clear, we've pointed out a number of issues with FEMA, particularly in the frustrating recovery phase. I want to see that they're making sure that we don't break what's not broken and we fix the issues that are broken. And there are a number of those things.
I've been speaking with Chris Currie. He's Director, Homeland Security and Justice at the Government Accountability Office. Thank you so much for sharing this report and for this important work.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.